So what we're doing is today is our last week of Genesis, and so hopefully you've been enjoying it. I'm hoping that you on your own time have read the entire book of Genesis, and you've gotten somewhat of a grasp on it. Do you feel like you know more than when you came in here at least? Yes, okay, good. Do you think you got like the big picture, even if you don't know all the fine details, the big picture of Genesis? We're not as confident on that one. Okay. Here's what we're going to do then to start us off is we're going to do a little recap here so that we can see if we can get the big picture, because it's really not that complicated once you can see the big picture. All right, so last week I did a little bit of a recap, and I'm going to do it again this week. So the author is Moses, of course, and the purpose of the writing was it's a book of origins. It tells us here's where we came from, right? It tells us it answers all the big questions of life. And it's divided into two major categories. Genesis 1, we still didn't get that fixed. Remember last week when we talked about that? We're struggling right now. Genesis 1 through, that's supposed to be 11, and then this is 12 through, that's supposed to be 50. We're still failing. It's been a week and we haven't figured it out. All right. To be honest, but Nate, our amazing tech guy, he had pneumonia, and so he's been out, so we will not blame him. We're just glad he's here. Okay, so here's the outline. And if you have your Masterclass books, if you go to the last couple pages there, you're going to have some blank pages. If you want to write in there this outline to help you track and maybe see the big picture, that might be helpful for you. And so last week you might have started writing it. I'm going to give you the second half of the outline. For those of you who didn't take the notes, I encourage you to take these notes. So first thing, and we're going to go by the topics and the stories, is creation. Those are chapters 1 and 2. And it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's one of the key verses. But what happens in those first couple chapters is God gives us, and I would like to think of it like this. He gives us a place, a people, and a purpose. All right, this is just for me to remember. Maybe it'll be helpful for you. He gives us a place. And this is a place not just for us. This is actually his place. This is his kingdom where he rules and he reigns. And then he creates people. That would be us. And we're supposed to be co-creators with him. We're going to partner with him. We're going to be his representatives on earth. And then he gives us a purpose. He says, I want you to love me, and I want you to love one another, and then I want you to work, and I want you to co-create. Now, very quickly, we see that things go off the rails, because in chapter 3, we have the fall. And the fall introduces the problem. Everybody in the world knows that there's a problem. Nobody looks at the world and says it's perfect. And this explains what the problem is we have rebelled against God. We've said we don't want anything to do with you. We want to be in charge of our own lives. We want to be the ultimate authority. And so what happens is things begin to spiral out of control very quickly. One of the obvious consequences, besides shame and pain and suffering, is death. This thing called death enters into the world, and we see it, the generation right after Adam and Eve with their children, Cain and Abel. Cain ends up killing Abel, and death is introduced on a very personal level. But by the end of chapter 3, even though they have introduced this dramatic problem, God says, I'm going to give you a promise, all right? So those are the 5 key words when I think about the big picture of the opening chapters, is I have God who has created a place, a people, a purpose. We also see the problem and the promise. And so the promise is that one day he will defeat this sin and this death that has now been introduced in the world. And the imagery is, of course, of a man who comes and crushes the serpent, which is the source of the evil in the story. And as he does this, he crushes it with his heel, but the snake ends up striking him, and he suffers and he dies. And remember, this is at the very beginning of the story, because of course it's pointing towards, well, as we know, Jesus one day. You get into chapters 5 through 9, and things are going downhill very quickly. It started with Cain and Abel, and it ends in an entire group, entire people, humanity, spinning out of control. And so God looks at the world and he says, it's a mess. I don't know why I even created you people. This is turning out to be quite the headache. Maybe I should just erase you off the face of the earth, and we should call it a day. But he says, if there is one righteous man, I will save him. And there is. His name is Noah, and so God calls Noah, and he says, I'm going to cleanse the earth of all of its wickedness and all of its evil, but I'm going to preserve you and your family on this thing called the ark. And so you guys are going to go on there, you're going to bring 2 of each animal. You probably remember that story. And so he does, and he cleanses the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Eventually, they come upon dry land, and they begin to repopulate the world. And that's what we start to see in the coming chapters. Chapters 10 and 11 are about the table of nations, which is really about how there were 70 nations at the time and how humanity continued to develop and to grow. But the problem is they were pretty much who they were before the flood, is the ultimate problem of sin had not been taken care of. Is they were still evil, they were still rebellious, and there's a great example, it's called the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel is, we don't want to worship you, we don't want to bow down to you, we want to be gods ourselves. And so we're going to build this tower that's going to go up into the heavens, and God, in his grace, destroys it. And if you remember, we talked about why they were actually going to destroy themselves, they weren't going to destroy God. And so that gets us through the first 12 chapters of Genesis. And then there begins to shift from these stories of kind of prehistory stories into what we call the patriarchs. The patriarchs are the people who God has used in order to build this entire group, this entire nation of people. And so the first one, and we talked about this, is Abraham. So have I gone past it yet? Yeah, Abraham, right down here at the bottom if you can't see it. And God calls Abraham, and here's what he says. And do we have that Genesis passage? Let's see if it's in here anywhere. I'll come back. Let me see. This is all new to me. There it is right there. Okay. Here's what he says. His name was Abram, later Abraham, and he says, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. Now, the first thing that he says is, and this is the promise to Abraham, is I am going to give you a place. Now, remember what we talked about in the opening chapters? What is the thing that was lost? That originally was given to Adam and Eve? Well, it was a place. And what was the consequences of their sin? They were kicked out of that place. And so what is God now saying? Well, I'm going to give you a place. And this is going to be a place for you and for your entire family. And he says, and I will make you into a great nation. Now remember, what was the second thing that God created? People. And he says, not only do I want to have a relationship with people, but people need one another. And so what is the second thing that God promises to Abraham? He says, I'm going to give you people, a people. And this is not going to be just any people. This is going to be so many people that is going to be like the stars in the sky. It's going to be an entire nation of people, which if you know what's happening in the middle of the story, how old is he at this time? About 75 and childless. And so he's thinking, yeah, it would be great if I were a dad or, and a whole nation would be amazing, but so far nothing's happening. And he says, and I will bless you and I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. And so somehow this guy who's obscure and is a nobody is going to become world famous, not because of what he has done, but what God is about to do through him. And he says, and he's going to bless. He's going to bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And so somehow what he's going to do through Abraham, and then eventually his family that becomes a nation, is going to bless the entire world. And so that's kind of the big picture of what he promises to Abraham. Now, we don't stop at Abraham, of course, because Abraham has some children. And so we get into the next generation of Abraham's family, which is Isaac. And he tells Abraham to take Isaac up to the top of this mountain and to sacrifice his son. But at the last minute, God stops him and says, no, I'm going to provide a sacrifice. Now, within the context of what's taking place, okay, it's a test of faith, but what exactly is happening here? Well, as you're going to see, and you're going to see this in today's story, is this is all foreshadowing. It's all pointing towards something that's going to happen in the future. So Isaac has children, Jacob and Esau. They're twins. They hate each other. And we went over that story because Jacob steals Esau's blessing and they almost go to war and eventually they reconcile. But Jacob's story is quite a mess. And then we get to Jacob's 12 children. Jacob has 13 kids. He has 12 boys and 1 girl. They become the 12 tribes of Israel. And the most famous out of the bunch is a man named Joseph. And so that's who we're going to be talking about today. Is the last big chunk of Genesis primarily focuses on Joseph and his story. And so a lot of you guys are probably familiar with this story, and it's not going to be new, but I'm going to try to give you a little bit of an overview because it's going to be chapters 37 all the way through 50, and there's kind of a random in the middle of it. There's another story that takes place, and so I don't want you to get thrown off with that either. Okay, so here's kind of the basic idea when it comes to Joseph. He is his father's favorite because he was born to him in his old age. And so to show him that he is the favorite, he gives him this beautiful coat, which we've probably all heard of before, and it makes all of his brothers jealous. And to make matters worse, Joseph doesn't just flaunt around in this beautiful coat. He goes and he tells his brothers, I keep having these amazing dreams. And you know what the dreams tell me? The dream's telling me that you, all of you, even though you're older than me, you're going to one day bow down to me. Now, if you've had a sibling, just imagine your sibling coming and telling you this. I've had a dream. God has told me one day you will bow down to me. Yikes. Well, that doesn't please them, and they start to get even more angry. And so as they're out there tending to sheep in the field one day, they start to come up with a plan. Well, maybe we should do something about this Joseph. I mean, he's not even out here working with us right now. He's at home with dad. And kind of cut to the scene where he's out there with his father, Jacob, who later his name becomes Israel, just making sure you're paying attention. And he sends him out and he goes, why don't you go check on your brothers, see how they're doing. And so as they're watching their brother, who they've already been talking about and they've already been thinking about and they have this deep hatred for, they say this in Genesis 37. I'm going to have to get used to me doing this. All right. The Lord had said to Abram, oh, no, that's not it. Oh my goodness. Where are we going? See, I told you I'm not good at this yet. Here comes the dreamer. They said to each other, come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Now, you've probably had some brawls with your siblings before. Has it ever got to this degree where they're thinking about killing you? And so one of the brothers, Reuben, who is the oldest, he jumps in and he says, guys, time out. He's obviously the more mature of the group, and he's going to be the level-headed one. And he says, look, we don't want to kill him, but what we can do is we'll throw him into a cistern, and at least we'll show him that he needs to keep his mouth shut. So it continues on. Verse, there we go, 23. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty. There was no water in it. All right, so they strip him down naked. They throw him into this empty well, and then they've got to figure out, okay, now what are we going to do? And so here's how I imagine the scene goes, is they throw him in there. He's whining. He's complaining. He's like, guys, let me out of here again. So, and they're sitting having lunch, and then all of a sudden, when they're trying to figure out what to do, because half of them are probably ready to pull the trigger, literally, and take him out. They see this caravan of traders who are on their way to Egypt pass by, and they're going to go and sell their goods. And so they think, we have something to sell. Let's sell our brother. And so another brother, Judah, who we're going to hear a little bit about his story, he jumps in and he says this. He says, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Now, again, my imagination is he's overhearing this. They're eating lunch, having a conversation, and he's going, Judah, I always liked you. I knew that you had a level head. Yes, what good will it be if you kill me? I think that you should probably let me out, and we'll forget about this whole thing, and I won't tell Dad what you did. But then he continues, he says, come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay a hand on him. After all, he is our brother. See, he is caring. He is our brother, our own flesh and blood. And his brothers agreed. And so instead of them killing him, they get him out of there, and they decide to sell him off into slavery, where he is hauled into Egypt. They divide the money up. They take his clothes. They tear it apart. They splash some blood on it, and they go to their father, and they tell him, your son, whom they all know is his favorite son, he has been killed by a wild animal. And what happens in that moment is they break their father's heart. He cannot be comforted, because not only is it difficult to lose a child, I can't even imagine that kind of pain, but this was his favorite child. And it says that he never recovered from this heartbreak. When we go and we follow Joseph in his story, we find out that he arrives in Egypt and he is purchased by a man named Potiphar, who was the captain of the guard for Pharaoh. And so he's a very high-ranking, very wealthy person, a powerful man. And it's weird because the story kind of cuts right here. And it goes into the next chapter, chapter 38, and we see the story of Judah. Now, I'm not going to tell you the story of Judah because that is a whole nother story that would probably take me the entire time. But I'll tell you this. If you have been skipping any chapters in Genesis, don't skip that one. It is wild. There are things that take place in that story that I don't feel comfortable talking about in public, and the end result is quite a twist. And so make sure you don't miss his story. But we'll go back to Joseph in 39. So here's what it says in chapter 39. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of the household, and he entrusted to his care everything that he owned. And so it became very obvious a couple of things about Joseph. One, he has a lot of talent. We will see that he is pretty much successful at whatever he does. And it's not just this natural talent that he has. We say that it's something that is given to him by God. That as he continues to remain faithful to God, God continues to remain faithful to him. Not necessarily in his circumstances, because those don't get any better, as you will hear. Those continue to get worse. But because Joseph, even in those difficult moments, remains faithful to God, God remains faithful to him. And so Potiphar recognizes that this man has talent, he has charisma, and there is something that God has blessed him with and continues to bless him with. And so he says, look, you're in charge. You can run everything. In fact, Potiphar's one job is for him to eat, which I thought, that's a perfect job description. I would like that job. Is somebody who runs everything so well, all I need to be concerned about is what am I going to have for my next meal? Continues in this, but this is kind of like if in the movie you hear the dun 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 dun, like that kind of part, like where it's just, you know what I'm talking about, where it gets kind of dark and it gets kind of ominous and you go, uh-oh, something bad's about to happen. This is this scene right here. Is they mention that now that Joseph is well built and handsome. So I like to think of this as the curse of beauty, and it is a curse that I'm quite familiar with. All right, that was way more of a laugh than I thought it was going to get. I thought it was going to be like, meh, meh, but it was like, no, that's crazy. That's like, you're the opposite of that. Anyway, because this ends up becoming, and you know what's funny is I was listening to, this is not in my notes, this is a freebie. I was listening to, remember Jim Collins? He was like a leadership author kind of expert. And he says that there is a curse of charisma. That if you have too much charisma, it is actually bad for you. And he explains, I think, because of your character and things like that. I think that's also true if you are physically attractive, not just your personality being attractive, but physically. And this becomes an obstacle for him as well, because people start to take notice. After a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. If you look at different translations, and I didn't put them up here, but there's some pretty funny translations of what this means in the Hebrew. One of them is sex now. That was kind of great. I thought that one was funny. But she's pretty straightforward, and she says, look, this is what I want from you. And this is a pivotal moment for Joseph. And here's the crazy thing, is Joseph is a man of character, and Joseph, time after time, makes the right decision. And yet, he experiences consequences because of it. So here's what happens in verse 8. But he refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against? Now this is important, because this shows you where his character comes from. How could I do such a thing and sin against God? So it's not just against Potiphar. It's not just that he's my friend and he's given me opportunities. All those are true. But ultimately, the reason why I won't do this is because I'm going to be sinning against God. Continues to remain faithful. And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. And so he is a man that is continuing to maintain his character day after day after day. She tries to hit on him. He says no, until one day, the house was empty, and she just grabs Joseph by the cloak and says, no, today you are coming to bed with me. But he decides no, he refuses, he runs away. She holds on to the cloak, and she begins to scream. She makes this scene where the servants come in, they come in, they ask what has happened, and she says, Joseph tried to sleep with me. So she twists the whole thing and puts it on him. And then when Potiphar gets home later that evening, she goes and she tells Potiphar what took place. That your guy, Joseph, who is supposed to be a slave and take care of this house, is trying to sleep with me. What are you going to do about it? And so what he does about it is he throws him in prison. So Joseph, even though he did the right thing, ends up in prison. While Joseph was in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all of those he held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. So everywhere that he ends up, right? So his circumstances don't improve. In fact, they seem to get worse. And yet everywhere he goes, he's simultaneously blessed by God, that he has these incredible gifts and that God continues to use him. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care. Sounds very familiar to Potiphar and what he was doing there, because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. And so he goes in there and he starts leading everyone. In fact, he does so well that they don't even have to worry about it now. And it happens to be that two of the prisoners are high-profile inmates. One was the baker to the king, and the other was the cupbearer. And those are high positions because those are the people who have access to the king, and those are the ones that are trusted enough to serve the king food and wine. Meaning, if someone was going to get after the king, usually through poison, it would have to be through these two guys. And so they were so trusted. Now, it doesn't tell us what they did, but somehow they offended the king and they ended up in prison. And so they begin to have dreams. And apparently, as they're having these dreams, they wake up and they're upset about it. And Joseph asks, okay, well, what's the big deal? Why are you having these nightmares? And so the cupbearer begins to explain, okay, here's my dream, and here's kind of what I'm experiencing. And Joseph, he has the gift of interpretation, and so he begins to interpret these. And he says, all right, your dream means that in 3 days, you are going to be released from prison and restored to your previous position, which the guy goes, that's a good dream. And so he reminds them, look, when this happens, I want you to remember me and mention me to Pharaoh so that I also can get out of here. Oh, yeah, no problem, buddy. I got you. Then the baker comes along and he tells him his dream and he says, okay, this is what's happening. And does it also mean that I'm going to be released? He says, well, your dream means that you also are going to be freed from prison very soon, but it's going to be because they're going to behead you. Sorry. Both of those dreams do come true within a few days. The cupbearer is restored and the baker is dead. And so Joseph is thinking, good, they're going to be my ticket out of here. God has arranged this so that I would meet these people and I would be able to interpret their dreams, and then they would be on my side. Now I have somebody on the inside of Pharaoh's kingdom. Well, the problem is that as soon as they get out, they forget about Joseph. Well, the one guy. The other guy, he forgets about everything. Here's what it says in chapter 41. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Got back in the palace, got back to tasting wine for the king, and thought, you know what? I don't need to worry about my past and all those people in prison because I'm free. That is until about 2 years later. So remember, this is 2 years. He's sitting in prison just waiting for God to do something. Pharaoh begins to have some dreams. And he starts to look for people within his kingdom that can interpret these. And so he goes to magicians, and he goes to the wisest men of Egypt, and he says, can any of you interpret my dream? Tell me what these mean. And nobody could tell him. And then the cupbearer remembers, I used to do time with this guy who can interpret dreams. And so maybe we should go and we should talk to him because he was able to interpret mine. And you remember the baker? Yeah, he's gone. Well, he was interpret his too. And so let's go to prison. Let's go get this prisoner and let's see if he knows what all of this means. And so that's exactly what happens. Pharaoh says to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it, but I've heard of it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. But then he gives this weird response. Well, I can't do it. Well, then what are you doing here, man? Why did I get you out of prison? But then he replies, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. This just shows you who this man is. He's a man of character and a man of deep faith. Because in that moment, it would be really easy to take credit. Yes, I can interpret your dream if you will allow me to get out of prison. No problem. Oh, yeah, I have a special talent. Too bad you've thrown me out into prison. I mean, you'd benefit having a guy like me around. He continues to deflect and says, no, it's not about me. It's about God. And so anything that I am able to do, it's because God is doing it through me. And so in the scene, you have Pharaoh beginning to explain what his dreams are. And Joseph tells him what they mean. Basically, the idea is that your kingdom is about to, not just your kingdom, but the entire world that they knew of is about to have a famine. You're going to have 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. And so what you need to do is you need to go out and you need to collect and store enough food during those 7 years of abundance so that you can provide for everybody during the 7-year famine. And so he's impressed by this because he was also able to reveal certain things that he shouldn't know about. And so he's convinced that what Joseph is saying is true. And so Pharaoh says, since God has made all this known to you, there's no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Wow, now that's quite a day right there. I don't know if you've had those days where you just think, man, I have been productive today. He woke up in prison, and then he went to sleep in the palace. And now he is the second most powerful person in the entire kingdom besides Pharaoh himself. And so as the story continues on, we find out that, yes, he does become second in charge, and he's given a wife, and he has children, an incredible amount of wealth and power and acclaim. He is living the Egyptian dream. And all the things that he predicted, they came to pass. They had 7 years of abundance, and they followed his instructions, and they collected a bunch of extra, and they put it in reserves. And then they had a 7-year famine. And during this 7-year famine, it didn't just hit them, it hit everywhere, including his family that he hasn't seen, well, since he was sold into slavery. And so back home, Jacob, his father, calls the remaining boys together, and he says, look, we've run out of food. We're going to starve here. But I have heard that in Egypt, they have an abundance of food that we can go and we can purchase. And so I want you to go, and I want you to get some food for us. And so they go, make the journey to Egypt, and eventually they arrive, and they stand in front of the governor who is in charge of all of the supplies of food, and they ask him if they can buy some grain. Now, who is the governor? Their brother, of course, Joseph. Now, he recognizes them, but they don't recognize him because it's been such a long time, and they weren't expecting it. They're thinking, this brother is long gone. And so when he sees that these are his brothers who have sold him into slavery, he puts them through a series of tests. First thing he does is he accuses them of being spies. Oh, I know why you're here in Egypt. You don't want to buy grain. It's because you're trying to see what our weaknesses are. I knew there was something sketchy about you. You all are a bunch of, you know what? Take these men and throw them into prison. They're spies. And so he throws them into prison. And eventually he makes them a deal. And through conversation, they reveal that, well, we had one brother that was lost. He died, referring to him. And we have another brother. He's the youngest. His name is Benjamin, but he's still at home because he's like kind of our father's favorite. And so he wasn't allowed to come. And so Joseph says, all right, I'll make you a deal. One of you has to stay here with me. But the others, you can go home, and I want you to bring back this brother, Benjamin, to me and prove to me that you are not spies. So if you return with this brother, I'll know who you really are. And so he sends them off, and he sends them with a bunch of food, and he even sneaks in the money that they had paid for the food into the sacks, and he sends them on their way. Eventually, they get back home, and they go and they meet their father, and they say, Father, one of our brothers is back there, and he's being held captive because this governor who's in charge, he wants to meet Benjamin. And he says, the only way that we're going to get our other brother back is if we bring all of us go, and we convince him that we're not spies. And Jacob says, absolutely not. He's been heartbroken because of what happened to Joseph this entire time. He says, I can't bear to lose another son, especially this son, Benjamin. And so they don't go back for the other brother. He stays there in Egypt for a while until they run out of food. And once they've run out of food, they have no choice. They have to go back, and Egypt is the only place that they can go to. And they know if they return back and ask for food, but they haven't done what they've been asked, they're going to be in trouble. Not only will they not get food, they might get thrown into prison. And so, because they have no choice, they head back, and they bring Benjamin with them. Eventually, they get to Egypt with the entire crew. Joseph invites them into his home and has a meal with them. And the whole time, they're just anxious. They're thinking, is this a trick? Is he going to arrest us? Does he still think that we're spies? Is he going to throw all of us in prison? What exactly is the catch here? What exactly is he trying to do? And so at this meeting, he begins to question them about their food and about their family as they're eating their foods and who they are and why they come and who this Benjamin character is. And as they're doing this and they're having this meal, Joseph tells one of his servants, I want you to go and I want you to get all of the sacks that that they're going to store the food. I want you to pack it with food, pack it with the money that they're going to pay for it, and then in one of them, I want you to put my chalice. And it's like this big, beautiful, ornate, expensive kind of, cup thing. I don't know. I don't have one. I would like one. Snoop Dogg has one. I don't have one. So he puts it in there, and the meal begins to wrap up, and he sends them back on their way. But as soon as they're leaving, he sends one of his servants, and he stops them, and he brings them back, and he says, one of you has stolen from me my special chalice. And they go, no, none of us would do that. We wouldn't steal that. That's crazy. You've been so good to us and so generous. We could never steal that. He says, and they start to make promises, put us to death if we've stolen something from you. And so he goes and he starts to empty out sack by sack by sack, trying to figure out whose it is in. And eventually they get to Benjamin. And they pour it out, and guess whose sack it's in? Benjamin's. Now, of course, he's set this whole thing up. He's done it on purpose. He says, now, Benjamin, you are going to become my servant. You're going to be my slave. And they're losing it because they're thinking, this is going to kill our father. We can't go home without Benjamin. You might as well take all of us. And this starts to get emotional. It talks about how Joseph, during all of this, during this entire scene, has to step back and take breaks because he's crying, because he's so emotional about what's taking place here. And eventually he gets to this moment where he can't take it any longer. So he kicks out all of his servants, he kicks out everybody in the room, and he says this. He says, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother, Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. Can you imagine their faces? Can you imagine what that would be right there? Their hearts just sank into their stomachs because they're thinking, you know what I would do if I were him right now? I mean, we were upset with him because he talked about dreams and he had too cool of a coat. We sold him into slavery. Can you imagine what he's going to do? I'm sure we're going to end up in prison. If not worse, he's going to torture us. He's going to make an example of us. He's probably been planning this the entire time, and God has delivered us into his hands. And yet that's not at all what he says. He says, I'm not angry at you. In fact, he's going to talk about why he believes God has been in the middle of this. But before he does that, he says, look, I'm not angry. In fact, all of this is kind of a part of God's plan. But I know that Dad's getting older, and I really want to see him. Because I got to see all my brothers again, and so I want you to go back home, and I want you to tell Father that I am still alive and that he needs to come back here so that we could be reunited. So that's what they do. They go home, they tell their father. He can't believe it. He's like, there's no way. He's probably pretty upset because he's been lied to this entire time as well. And they bring Jacob back, and there's this reunion moment where the whole family is back together. And we get a little glimpse of what that looked like in chapter 46. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. Israel said to Joseph, now I am ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive. And so it's like in that moment, all of this pain that he's had for all of these years is just wiped away. It's just these brokenness and these wounds that seem like they could never be healed, seems to be healed when he's reunited in that moment. And so Joseph says, you guys aren't going home. I'm not sending you home with a bunch of stuff. You're staying here with me. I'm going to provide a place for you. In fact, he goes and he introduces him to Pharaoh himself. And Pharaoh, because Joseph is such a close companion and such a great worker, provides the entire family. Here's some land. Here's some livestock. Here's money. You're never going to have another need again. All of this is for you. And here's kind of the big conclusion of the story, the part that it's all been pointing to. After they have this reunion, and Jacob actually ends up dying because he said, look, now that I've seen my son, I can die a happy man. And they send him to be buried in his homeland. He says this. This is probably the key in the whole story. You intended to harm me, he's talking to his brothers, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. And so in this moment, he recognizes a few things. He recognizes that what you have done is evil. It's wrong, and you chose freely to do that. And yet, at the same time, God worked that into his sovereign plan, and that at the end, that evil thing would turn out to be good. And if you've ever been a student of philosophy, this is one of those questions, is how do you deal with the evil in the world and God's sovereignty, our free will, and God? And in this, it kind of gives us a little summary of, oh, that's how God does it. Is he somehow is able to orchestrate the world in such a way where we make our free decisions, and yet he is still in control of everything. But the biggest part of this story, probably the most significant part of this story, is when you step back and you look at, okay, what is like the bullet points here? Let me give you a couple of the bullet points and see if this story sounds familiar. The object, that Joseph was the object of his father's special love. He was envied and hated for no reason, even by his own family. He claimed one day that he would rule, which angered everybody around him, was sent by the father to care for his brothers, was rejected, stripped of his clothing, and condemned to die. He was sold for silver to the Gentiles. He became a servant. He resisted temptation and was falsely accused. He was assumed to be dead, never to be seen again. He was raised to rule over all and would save many, even those who mocked him, and they would be reconciled to those who persecuted him. Does that story sound familiar at all? Right, because this story that happened, what was it, 1,500 years before Jesus? It's not just a coincidence. Because remember how I talked about all these stories are pointing towards something in the future, And this story was a story that was going to point to the ultimate servant, the one who would ultimately have to give his life so that we could be reconciled, the one that ultimately would be able to forgive us for our wrongdoings. And so when we think about God's providential plan, and we think about what is God doing in the world, when I read stories like this, I think, whatever is happening, and it may feel chaotic, and it may feel a little bit out of control, and you got to imagine being Joseph in the middle of it going, God, what's going on here? I thought we had worked our way out of slavery, and now I'm a prisoner, and now what is going on? And God's going, I got it. I mean, it's full of twists and turns, and you're probably not going to like some parts of this, but ultimately it's going to end up where I want it to end up. And if you're faithful, it's going to end up where you want it to end up as well. So I wanted to just use that as a little bit of encouragement. Are we out of here at 7:15? We're out of here whenever I'm done. Is that kind of the deal? Is that the story? Yeah. It's a little bit of encouragement because I've been talking to some folks, and apparently there's an election coming up. I don't know. I haven't really been paying attention. I've just heard that. And it might be a little bit contentious, and people are worried about what's happening in the world and all the chaos and how there's wars, and and we're going to get into Revelation. But here's in a couple weeks about, man, how do we make sense of all this? But I love stories like this because it reminds me, oh yeah, God's in control. He's got it. Even when we're in the midst of the chaos, he still has a plan. And this is yet just another example of God's sovereignty. So let's pray. Lord God, thank you for stories like this where we get to hear about Joseph and just the roller coaster ride that he was on. Sometimes it feels like that's where we're at too, is we can't buy a break and things are just not going our way. And yet if we look at Joseph, and ultimately Joseph is pointing towards Jesus, it says that if we're faithful, that you also will be faithful. And so, Lord, if there's anything that we can learn from the book of Genesis, that would be it, is that our job is to be faithful and know that you are God and we can trust you. And so, Lord, I pray that this head knowledge would sink deep into our hearts and that we would become people who are full of deep faith and deep character, no matter what we find ourselves in the middle of. Lord, we love you. We thank you. It's your name we pray. Amen.